Have you ever wondered why so many people with ADHD end up searching for something deeper? Not just strategies, not just productivity systems, not just medication, but something that feels like meaning, something that explains why their mind works the way it does. Why so many ADHD women eventually become fascinated by psychology, symbolism, astrology, archetypes, spirituality, mythology, human behavior, or systems like Kabbalah. Why so many of them spend years trying to understand themselves, and why, even after receiving a diagnosis, many still feel that the diagnosis alone doesn't explain everything. Because the diagnosis may explain how the mind functions, but it doesn't answer a deeper question. Why does this experience feel the way it does? Why does life sometimes feel so overwhelming, so intense, so chaotic, and yet at the same time so rich, creative, and full of possibility? What if ADHD is not only a neurological difference? What if it also contains a spiritual lesson? Not because ADHD is magical, not because suffering is somehow enlightened, and certainly not because having ADHD makes someone more evolved than anyone else, but because every challenge shapes the way we grow, and every nervous system creates a unique path through life. Today, I want to explore a perspective that is rarely discussed, a perspective inspired by Kabbalah, archetypal wisdom, and nervous system understanding, a perspective that does not ask how to fix ADHD, but instead asks, what if there is something this experience is trying to teach us? What if the goal was never to become someone else? What if the goal was to become more fully ourselves? One of the reasons ADHD feels so difficult in modern life is that modern life was not designed for the way many ADHD minds naturally operate. We live in a culture that rewards consistency, predictability, sustained attention, routine, and linear progress. We are taught that success means focusing on one thing, following one path, and moving steadily toward one goal. But many ADHD minds do not move in straight lines. They move in patterns. They move in associations. They move through curiosity. They move through energy. One thought connects to another thought. One idea opens 10 more. One question leads to an entire universe of possibilities. What appears chaotic from the outside often feels like exploration from the inside. The problem is that modern systems usually interpret this difference as failure. If you struggle with routines, you are undisciplined. If you struggle with consistency, you are unreliable. If you struggle with organization, you are irresponsible. At least that is the message many people receive, and after years of hearing these messages, many begin to believe them. But Kabbalah offers a very different perspective. Kabbalah views reality as a relationship between energy and structure, light and vessel, expansion and containment, flow and form. Neither side is considered better. Both are necessary. Without light, nothing grows. Without a vessel, nothing remains. Without expansion, there is no creativity. Without structure, there is no stability. One of the most interesting things about many ADHD minds is that they often seem naturally connected to movement, possibility, creativity, exploration, and expansion. There is often tremendous energy, tremendous curiosity, tremendous imagination, tremendous openness. The challenge is not usually the absence of energy. The challenge is learning how to contain it. learning how to direct it, learning how to hold it. And from a spiritual perspective, that changes the entire conversation. Because suddenly ADHD is no longer a story about deficiency. It becomes a story about relationship, a relationship between energy and structure, potential and embodiment, vision and implementation. Many people with ADHD describe feeling like they have more ideas than they can execute, more inspiration than they can organize, more possibilities than they can realistically pursue. This can feel frustrating, but it can also reveal something important. The energy is not missing. The vessel is under development. And perhaps that development is part of the journey itself. This is where many neurodivergent people become drawn toward mystical systems, not because they are irrational, not because they are escaping reality, but because symbolic systems often mirror the way they naturally think. Most conventional education teaches linear thinking. Step 1. Step 2. Step 3. But symbolic systems are different. Everything connects to everything else. Patterns matter. Relationships matter. Meaning matters. The whole becomes more important than the individual parts. This is why so many people with ADHD become fascinated by archetypes, mythology, astrology, Kabbalah, depth psychology, and symbolic frameworks. These systems often feel intuitive, not because they remove complexity, but because they organize complexity. They provide architecture. They provide structure. They transform chaos into pattern. And pattern creates relief. When you finally find a framework that helps you understand your experience, something inside the nervous system relaxes, not because all problems disappear, but because confusion begins to disappear. You stop asking, "What is wrong with me?" and start asking, "How am I designed?" That is a very different question, and it often leads to very different answers. But there is another side to this story, a shadow side. Because the same qualities that make ADHD minds deeply curious can also make them vulnerable. Many people with ADHD become trapped in endless seeking, always searching, always learning, always consuming, always gathering information, always preparing, always researching. The next book, the next course, the next system, the next spiritual teaching, the next breakthrough, and yet somehow life never fully changes. The knowledge grows, but the embodiment does not. This is where Kabbalah offers one of its most important lessons. Light without a vessel eventually becomes overwhelming. Expansion without containment becomes chaos. Possibility without structure becomes anxiety. Many ADHD women know exactly what this feels like. The feeling of having 50 tabs open in your mind. The feeling of being excited by everything and grounded in nothing. The feeling of constantly receiving inspiration but struggling to transform it into reality. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is not a failure of spirituality. It is often a challenge of containment. And containment is not punishment. Containment is love. A river without banks becomes a flood. A fire without boundaries becomes destruction. Energy without structure becomes exhaustion. The purpose of structure is not to suppress life. The purpose of structure is to support life. This is one of the deepest spiritual lessons hidden inside the ADHD experience. Many people spend years trying to become less intense, less curious, less sensitive, less emotional, less imaginative, less themselves. But perhaps that is not the real task. Perhaps the task is learning how to create a vessel strong enough to hold what already exists. Not less energy, more containment, not less creativity, more direction, not less sensitivity, more regulation, not less openness, more boundaries. This perspective changes everything, because suddenly structure is no longer the enemy. Structure becomes an act of self-respect, an act of self-care, an act of spiritual maturity. The tree of life itself teaches that every force requires balance. Too much expansion creates instability. Too much contraction creates rigidity. Growth happens between the two, and perhaps this is why sacred structure matters so much, because structure is not the opposite of spirituality. Structure allows spirituality to become real. Without structure, insight remains an idea. Without structure, healing remains a concept. Without structure, wisdom remains potential. The vessel is what allows light to stay. And that may be one of the most important lessons for neurodivergent minds. Not how to become someone else. Not how to force yourself into a system that was never designed for you, but how to build structures that honor your nature, structures that support your energy instead of fighting it, structures that create safety instead of restriction, structures that allow your gifts to emerge sustainably. So what might the spiritual meaning of ADHD actually be? Perhaps it is the invitation to learn conscious containment. Perhaps it is the invitation to transform overwhelm into wisdom. Perhaps it is the invitation to stop seeing yourself as broken and start seeing yourself as someone carrying a great deal of energy that requires a different kind of architecture. And perhaps that is why so many ADHD women eventually find themselves searching for deeper meaning, because beneath the diagnosis is a question, and beneath the question is a longing not simply to function, but to understand, not simply to survive, but to become whole. If there is one thing I hope you take away from this video, it is this. You do not need to become less of yourself. You do not need to extinguish your curiosity. You do not need to suppress your sensitivity. You do not need to eliminate your complexity. The spiritual path is rarely about becoming smaller. It is about becoming capable of holding more of who you already are. Perhaps the lesson of ADHD is not that you were given too much energy. Perhaps the lesson is learning how to build a vessel worthy of it. And when that begins to happen, something remarkable occurs. The same mind that once felt chaotic begins to feel creative. The same sensitivity that once felt overwhelming begins to feel intuitive. The same intensity that once felt exhausting begins to feel purposeful. Not because you changed who you are, but because you finally learned how to hold what was always there. And that may be one of the deepest forms of healing. Not becoming someone new, but becoming strong enough to contain your own light. If this perspective resonated with you, let me know in the comments. When did you first start wondering if your ADHD experience might have a deeper meaning? And if you're interested in exploring the intersection of neurodivergence, Kabbalah, archetypes, and spiritual structure, consider subscribing to Sacred Structure. Because sometimes the path forward is not about fixing yourself. Sometimes it is about understanding the architecture of your soul.